5:15 in the morning on the 14th of April, 2026. The Persian Gulf, 30 miles south of the Strait of Hormuz, USS Nimitz was already vibrating with the massive power of its 4 steam turbines as it began a heavy, deliberate turn into a light northerly wind. Something was moving across the dark water that did not belong on a commercial shipping lane, and it was moving at a speed exceeding 40 knots. The air over the flight deck was thick with the heavy, humid heat of the Gulf and the sharp iron tang of the sea. Below the flight deck, in the windowless chill of the Combat Direction Center, the blue-green glow of the AN/SPY-6 radar screens revealed a jagged, irregular line of 50 high-speed contacts closing rapidly from the direction of the Iranian coast. The commanding officer of the USS Nimitz stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the horizon. He did not need to see the targets to know what they were. For 72 hours, intelligence reports from the Fifth Fleet had warned of increased activity at the Iranian naval bases. The swarm was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a physical reality, appearing as 50 distinct pulses of light on the tactical displays. Each pulse represented a fast attack craft of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, many of them barely 15 meters long but carrying heavy machine guns, rocket launchers, and potentially improvised explosives. The silence on the bridge was broken only by the low hum of electronics and the steady, professional reporting of the watch officers. At 5:17, the Tactical Action Officer confirmed that the contacts had crossed the 20-mile mark. They were not responding to repeated radio hails on the international hailing frequency, bridge-to-bridge channel 16. The warnings were issued in both English and Farsi, clear and unmistakable. The United States Navy was demanding that the approaching vessels identify themselves and alter course immediately. 20 miles away, the Iranian swarm showed no signs of slowing. Instead, the jagged line began to fan out into a classic crescent formation, a maneuver designed to saturate the carrier strike group's defenses from multiple angles simultaneously. The speed of the approaching craft increased to 45 knots. On the flight deck, the yellow-shirted catapult crews moved with practiced efficiency. 2 FA-18 fighters were already hooked into the shuttles of Catapults 1 and 2, their engines whining as they reached flight idle. The smell of burnt JP-5 jet fuel began to drift through the ventilation systems of the ship, a scent that every sailor on board associated with the transition from routine operations to active combat. The escorting destroyer, USS Mason, a DDG-51 class vessel, moved into a screening position 5 miles ahead of the Nimitz. The destroyer began to corkscrew through the water, its own radar system slaving to the carrier's tactical data link. On the Mason, the Mark 45 5-inch gun turret rotated toward the horizon, its barrel elevating in a smooth, robotic arc. The sailors on the Mason could see the white wakes of the incoming Iranian boats through their long-range thermal optics. The boats were bouncing violently over the 2-meter swells, appearing and disappearing in the spray, but their heading remained locked on the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. By 5:22 in the morning, the distance had closed to 15 miles. The commanding officer of the Nimitz authorized the launch of the canned, alert aircraft. With a violent hiss of steam and a roar that shook the entire hull of the 90,000-ton ship, the first FA-18 fighter was flung into the gray morning sky. 3 seconds later, the second fighter followed. The aircraft did not climb for altitude. They stayed low, screaming over the water toward the approaching swarm to execute a show of force. The pilots of the fighters looked down at a sea that was beginning to churn with the wakes of dozens of small boats. The Iranian vessels were now close enough that the individual silhouettes were visible against the rising sun. They were running without lights, dark, shapes cutting through the white foam. The pilots reported back to the carrier that the boats were heavily laden, sitting low in the water, suggesting they were carrying maximum fuel and ammunition loads. In the Combat Direction Center, the tension was a physical weight. The rules of engagement were clear, but the stakes were higher than they had been in decades. A single mistake could lead to a catastrophic collision or an international incident that would set the entire region on fire. The strike group commander, watching from the flag bridge, knew that the next 5 minutes would determine the course of the day. The 50 boats were now within 12 miles. The inner edge, of the strike group's primary exclusion zone. The environment of the Gulf seemed to hold its breath. The sun, a blood-red disk, began to break over the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the water. The heat was already rising, shimmering off the steel of the carrier's deck. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of the waves against the hull and the distant, fading roar of the two fighters as they circled. The swarm. The Iranian boats did not flinch. They did not turn. They accelerated. 5:25 in the morning. The bridge of the destroyer, USS Mason, was bathed in the dim red light of tactical readiness, as the vessel maintained its position 5 miles ahead of the carrier. The Iranian fast attack craft were now exactly 8 miles from the hull of the USS Nimitz, their wakes carving white scars across the glassy surface of the Persian Gulf. The air around the destroyer was heavy with the smell of salt, and the ozone generated by the massive AN/SPY-6 radar arrays pulsing at maximum power. The two FA-18 fighters executed a low-altitude pass over the lead element of the Iranian formation, dropping a string of 20 magnesium flares. The flares ignited with a blinding white intensity, drifting slowly toward the water on small parachutes, illuminating the dark hulls of the speedboats below. The heat from the flares was momentarily felt by the Iranian crews as the fighters pulled in to a vertical climb, their afterburners twin points of orange fire against the pale morning sky. Despite the overwhelming display of aerial power, the 50 boats did not break formation. They continued their relentless advance, closing the distance at a steady 45 knots. On the bridge of the USS Nimitz, the commanding officer authorized the use of the long-range acoustic device. A series of high-pitched, directional sound pulses were fired toward the closest Iranian vessels, a noise so piercing it was designed to cause physical pain and disorientation to anyone not wearing specialized hearing protection. At the same time, the carrier's bridge team broadcast a final warning over the emergency frequency. The message was blunt: identify your intentions, or you will be fired upon. You are standing into danger. The response from the swarm was immediate and defiant. One of the Iranian boats, a larger vessel identified as a Tandar-class missile boat, turned its bow directly toward the USS Mason and illuminated the destroyer with its own fire control radar. On the Mason, the electronic warfare suite screamed a warning. The ship was being targeted. The tactical action officer on the destroyer did not hesitate, reporting the radar lock to the strike group commander on the Nimitz. The ladder of escalation had reached its final rung. The Iranian boats were now 7 miles out, well within the effective range of their anti-ship missiles and rocket-propelled grenades. Inside the Nimitz's hangar bay, the air was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the rhythmic clanging of heavy machinery. Ordnance teams were moving racks of AGM-114 Hellfire missiles toward the elevators, their faces set in grim masks of concentration. The ship was no longer merely a floating airfield. It was a fortress preparing for a siege. Every sailor on the flight deck was wearing a flash-protective hood and gloves, their sleeves rolled down to protect against the searing heat of potential fires. At 5:32 in the morning, the Iranian boats crossed the 5-mile line. At this range, the individual machine gun mounts on the speedboats were clearly visible through the carrier's high-resolution cameras. The lead boats began to zigzag, a tactic used to make them harder targets for the ship's defensive guns. The strike group commander, at coordinates 26 degrees 12 minutes north, 55 degrees 42 minutes east, looked at the tactical display one last time. The swarm was split into 3 distinct groups, attempting to encircle the carrier and its lone escort. The order was given to the USS Mason to fire warning shots with the 5-inch gun. The destroyer's turret snapped into position, its barrel level with the horizon. A single round was fired, the muzzle flash a brilliant yellow cone of fire that momentarily blotted out the rising sun. The shell hit the water exactly 500 meters ahead of the lead Iranian boat, sending a massive geyser of white water 50 feet into the air. The vibration of the shot rolled across the water, a physical shockwave that could be felt on the deck of the Nimitz 5 miles away. The Iranian boats ignored the geyser. They drove straight through the falling mist, their engines screaming as they pushed for maximum speed. The lead vessel began to fire its own heavy machine guns into the air, the red tracer rounds arching high over the USS Mason in a clear gesture of aggression. The engagement was no longer a matter of if, but when. The carrier was turning hard to starboard now, trying to keep its most heavily armored sections toward the threat, while clearing the path for its own defensive weapon systems. 5:35 in the morning. The destroyer, DDG-51, USS Mason, surged forward, its 4 gas turbine engines screaming, as they pushed the 9,000-ton vessel to 30 knots. The destroyer was now operating as the primary kinetic shield for the USS Nimitz, intentionally interposing its armored hull between the carrier and the most aggressive arc of the Iranian swarm. The wake from the Mason was a towering wall of white foam that surged 5 meters into the air, a physical boundary in the water that the smaller Iranian craft would have to navigate. On the deck of the destroyer, the gun crews for the 25mm chain guns and the 50 caliber machine guns were locked into their harnesses, their boots braced against the shuddering steel as the ship carved a hard turn to the northeast. The air around the strike group was becoming increasingly turbulent. At 5:38 in the morning, 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, call signs Raven 1 and Raven 2, lifted off from the Nimitz's flight deck in a cloud of salt spray and exhaust. The helicopters transitioned immediately into a low-level hover, barely 50 feet above the water, taking up positions on the flanks of the carrier. These aircraft were the eyes of the fleet, their sensors feeding real-time targeting data back to the carrier's tactical action officer. From their vantage point, the pilots could see the Iranian crews clearly. The men on the speedboats were wearing life jackets over civilian clothes, many of them filming the American ships with handheld cameras, even as they gripped the throttles of their high-performance outboard engines. The environment was a study in escalating friction. The sun was now high enough to create a blinding glare off the surface of the Gulf, a shimmering field of light that made visual tracking difficult for the gunners on the Mason. The heat was climbing toward 35 degrees Celsius, and the humidity was so thick it felt like a physical weight on the lungs of the sailors stationed on the exposed weather decks. The smell of the sea was being rapidly overtaken by the heavy, oily scent of unburned diesel from the 50 Iranian engines, and the sharp, metallic tang of the destroyer's own machinery working at maximum capacity. The Iranian swarm had now split into 3 distinct wolf packs. The first group of 15 boats was driving straight for the Mason, attempting to draw the destroyer's fire and attention. The second and third groups, each consisting of nearly 20 boats, were swinging wide to the north and south, clearly intending to bypass the screening destroyer and strike at the Nimitz from its less defended quarters. It was a sophisticated tactical maneuver and suggested that the swarm was being directed by a larger command vessel located further over the horizon. On the Nimitz, the bridge team monitored the defensive bubble, a series of concentric circles on the digital display that represented the lethal range of various weapon systems. The outermost circle was the domain of the FA-18 fighters. The middle circle belonged to the Mason's 5-inch gun and the Hellfire missiles of the helicopters. The innermost circle, the last line of defense, was the carrier's own close-in weapon systems and 25mm gun mounts. At 5:42 in the morning, the northern group of Iranian boats crossed the 4-mile threshold. The strike group commander issued the order to designate and track. This was not yet an order to fire for effect, but it meant that every weapon system in the strike group was now slaved to a specific target. On the Mason, the fire control computers were calculating the lead and elevation for 15 different targets simultaneously. The 5-inch gun turret jerked with mechanical precision, following the lead Iranian boat as it skipped across the tops of the waves. The silence of the morning was gone, replaced by the rhythmic thumping of the helicopters and the distant, high-pitched whine of the fast attack craft. The coordination of the American forces was systematic and professional. As the Iranian boats moved closer, the Raven helicopters began to drop flashbang canisters into the path of the northern pack. These non-lethal munitions detonated with a sharp crack, sending plumes of gray smoke and disorienting light across the water. It was a final attempt to break the swarm's resolve before the engagement turned lethal. On the radio, the American operators continued their broadcast, their voices calm but firm, repeating the warning that the strike group was prepared to defend itself with all necessary force. The Iranian response was a sudden, unified burst of speed. The northern pack ignited their secondary engines, the roar of the outboards audible, even over the sound of the Mason's turbines. They were no longer merely shadowing the fleet, they were charging. The distance dropped to 3 miles in less than 2 minutes. The defensive bubble was being compressed, and the window for a peaceful resolution was closing with every second. The commanding officer of the Nimitz gripped the rail of the bridge, his eyes scanning the horizon where the first sparks of real combat were about to ignite. 5:45 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, 28 miles south of the Strait of Hormuz. The destroyer USS Mason was the first to cross the threshold of active kinetic engagement as the northern pack of Iranian fast attack craft breached the 2-mile exclusion zone. The Iranian boats were now zigzagging at a speed of 48 knots, their bows lifting off the choppy water, completely ignoring the final series of green flares and warning shots fired from the bridge of the destroyer. The tactical action officer on the USS Mason confirmed that the hostile vessels had ignored all non-lethal deterrents and were now presenting a clear and present danger to the carrier strike group. At coordinates 26 degrees 12 minutes north, 55 degrees 44 minutes east, the commander of the strike group issued the command, "Batteries released. Engage the lead elements of the northern pack." The response from the USS Mason was a systematic and disciplined application of force. On the starboard side of the ship, the two 25mm Mark 38 chain guns whined as their electric motors brought the barrels to bear. These remote-operated weapons were slaved to the ship's high-resolution electro-optical sensors, allowing the gunners to track the bouncing speedboats with surgical precision, despite the erratic movement of the targets. The first burst of fire was a 3-round string of high-explosive incendiary tracers that cut through the humid morning air with the distinctive, mechanical thump-thump-thump that echoed across the water. The environment around the destroyer was instantly transformed. The sharp, acrid smell of spent cordite and burnt propellant began to drift across the weather decks, mingling with the heavy scent of diesel exhaust. The vibration of the chain guns was a rhythmic drumming that could be felt through the soles of the sailors' boots on the bridge. In the growing daylight, the red tracer rounds were visible as they reached out toward the lead Iranian boat, skipping off the surface of the water in bright arcs of light before finding their mark. The water around the Iranian formation erupted in hundreds of white geysers as the 50 caliber machine guns joined the engagement, creating a wall of lead and steel that the speedboats had to navigate. The first Iranian casualty was a 12-meter fast attack craft that had moved within 1,500 yards of the Mason. A burst from the 25mm chain gun struck the vessel's triple outboard engines. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for the small boat. The engines were shredded by the heavy rounds, and a plume of thick, black smoke erupted from the stern as the fuel lines were severed. The boat slewed violently to the left, its momentum carrying it into a high-speed spin before it came to a dead stop, in the water, bobbing helplessly in the wake of the other charging vessels. The Iranian crews did not retreat. Seeing their lead vessel disabled, the remaining 14 boats of the northern pack increased their speed and began to return fire with 7.62mm machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The red streaks of their tracers began to arch toward the USS Mason, most falling short into the sea, but several rounds clattered against the destroyer's armored hull and the superstructure near the bridge. The sound of small arms fire hitting the steel was a sharp, metallic pinging that served as a grim reminder that the engagement had moved beyond posturing. On the USS Nimitz, 5 miles to the rear, the flight deck was a beehive of controlled activity. Two MH-60 Sierra helicopters, Raven 1 and Raven 2, were cleared to engage the southern pack of boats with their door-mounted machine guns and Hellfire missiles. The strike group's defensive plan was unfolding with the cold efficiency of a programmed machine. The carrier continued its steady turn, putting its massive hull between the southern threat and its most vulnerable engineering spaces, while its own 25mm gun crews took their positions behind their ballistic shields. By 5:50 in the morning, the northern engagement had intensified. The USS Mason was now firing its 5-inch gun at the larger Tondar-class missile boat that was attempting to stay at the rear of the swarm. The sound of the 5-inch gun was a massive, chest-compressing boom that rolled across the Gulf like a clap of thunder, shaking the windows of the destroyer's bridge and sending a shockwave through the water that could be seen as a circular ripple. The shell impacted the water just meters from the Iranian missile boat, the resulting explosion sending a column of spray and debris 60 feet into the air. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex. While the Mason was successfully holding the northern pack at bay, the southern and central packs were continuing to close the distance to the Nimitz. The carrier strike group was now fully engaged in a 360-degree defense. The air was filled with the sounds of modern naval warfare. The high-pitched whine of jet turbines, the rhythmic thumping of helicopters, the mechanical chatter of chain guns, and the heavy, periodic roar of the destroyer's main gun. The Gulf was no longer a transit lane, it was a battlefield. 5:55 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, the central pack of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard swarm, had bypassed the USS Mason and was now exactly 1,500 yards from the starboard quarter of the USS Nimitz. The nuclear-powered aircraft carrier was no longer a distant observer of the conflict. The ship was a massive, vibrating wall of steel, its 4 propellers churning the water into a white frenzy as it maintained a speed of 30 knots. On the starboard sponsons, the crews of the 25mm Mark 38 chain guns were braced against their mounts, their thermal optics locked onto the lead-fast attack craft. The air around the carrier was screaming with the sound of wind and the high-pitched roar of the ship's own defensive systems coming online. The heat from the massive engines and the rising sun created a shimmering haze over the water, through which the dark shapes of the Iranian boats moved like predatory insects. The lead boat of the central pack, a high-speed catamaran armed with multiple rocket launchers, suddenly accelerated, its bow lifting 3 feet out of the water as it closed to within 1,000 yards. The commander of the USS Nimitz issued the final authorization for close-in defense. The starboard close-in weapon system, a 20mm Gatling gun, capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute, snapped into its tracking arc. The radar dome atop the system rotated with a high-pitched mechanical whine, locking onto the lead catamaran. The trigger was squeezed by the automated system. The gun erupted with a sound that was not a series of shots, but a continuous, bone-shaking roar like a massive sheet of metal being torn in half. A stream of white-hot tracer rounds punched through the humid air, creating a solid line of light between the carrier and the sea. The heat blast from the muzzle washed across the faces of the sailors on the nearby catwalks, and the smell of burning propellant was thick and suffocating. The 20mm tungsten rounds punched straight through the fiberglass hull of the lead Iranian boat, stitch-marking the vessel from bow to stern in less than 1 second. The impact was devastating. The rounds tore through the forward fuel cell, and the boat erupted instantly into a massive fireball that bleached the gray morning sky white. 6 tons of fiberglass and fuel were converted into a spray of burning fragments that rose 30 feet into the air. The internal pressure of the explosion blew the catamaran's engines clean off their mounts, sending the heavy blocks of iron skipping across the surface of the water like flat stones. The second boat in the formation, a smaller speedboat following 10 meters behind, reacted with frantic desperation. The pilot kicked the rudder hard to the left to avoid the burning wreckage of his leader, the boat heeling over so far that the port rail dipped under the water. But the momentum was too great. The speedboat slammed into a large piece of the lead boat's debris, a section of the hull still engulfed in flames. The collision severed the speedboat's steering cable, and it began to spin out of control, its crew leaping into the churned-up water as their own vessel began to take on fuel from the spreading slick. Black smoke rose in a towering column from the wreckage, the oily soot drifting back toward the carrier and coating the white-painted steel of the hull. The central pack's momentum was shattered in exactly 6 seconds. The remaining boats in the group swerved away, their formation breaking as they tried to put distance between themselves and the lethal accuracy of the carrier's close-in weapon system. The silence that followed the gun's firing was deafening, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the MH-60 Sierra helicopters closing in for the kill. High above the carrier, at coordinates 26 degrees, 14 minutes north, 55 degrees, 46 minutes east, Raven 1 saw the opening. The pilot of the MH-60 Sierra helicopter hovered steadily, the laser designator locked onto a second Iranian missile boat that was attempting to reposition. The pilot called rifle, and a single AGM-114 Hellfire missile shrieked off the rail. The missile was a blur of gray steel and white fire, its rocket motor leaving a corkscrew trail of smoke in the heavy air. The weapon punched through the bridge of the Iranian vessel, detonating inside the cabin. The boat did not just sink, it was obliterated, the force of the 1,000-degree explosion snapping the keel and sending the bow and stern sections sinking in opposite directions. The Gulf was now a landscape of fire and metal. To the north, the USS Mason continued to trade fire with the first pack, its 5-inch gun rounds creating massive columns of water that dwarfed the Iranian boats. On the flight deck of the Nimitz, the crew moved with a grim, practiced speed. The sounds of the engagement were constant. Now, the chatter of machine guns, the heavy thuds of missiles, and the roar of the carrier's own engines. The air was a cocktail of salt, diesel, and the metallic tang of blood and spent gunpowder. The Iranian swarm, once a unified threat, was becoming a collection of isolated targets, each one being systematically identified and neutralized. 6 in the morning. The sky over the Persian Gulf was a bruised purple, torn apart by the white-hot exhaust of 2 FA-18 fighters screaming back into the engagement zone. The initial shock of the carrier's close-in weapon system had shattered the central pack, but the remaining 30 boats of the Iranian swarm were attempting to regroup for a final, desperate surge. They were now operating in smaller, fragmented cells, trying to find gaps in the defensive perimeter of the USS Mason and the USS Nimitz. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of burning oil, and the heavy, humid weight of a Gulf morning that was rapidly turning into a furnace. On the flight deck of the Nimitz, the heat from the jet engines was a physical wall, shimmering over the non-skid surface as 2 more fighters were brought onto the catapults. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, Raven 1 and Raven 2, had transitioned from observation to active hunting. Hovering at 75 feet, the helicopters were stable firing platforms, their sensor balls rotating with mechanical precision as they designated targets for their door-mounted M241 machine guns. The sound of the helicopters was a rhythmic, bone-deep thumping that seemed to vibrate the very water beneath them. Each time the door gunners opened fire, a stream of brass shell casings rained down into the sea, and the smell of spent cordite was sucked into the rotor wash, blowing back into the cabin in a sharp chemical cloud. At 6:05 in the morning, the lead FA-18 fighter, call sign Blaze 1, rolled into a shallow dive toward a group of 5 Iranian speedboats that were attempting to flank the USS Mason from the north. The pilot's head-up display was a maze of green symbology, locking onto the heat signatures of the outboard engines. The pilot did not use missiles for this pass. Instead, he keyed the 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon. The jet shuddered as the rotary gun fired a half-second burst of 50 rounds. The sound was a high-pitched buzz, like a giant saw blade cutting through steel. The 20mm rounds walked across the water in a series of white splashes before finding the third boat in the line. The heavy shells punched through the fiberglass deck and into the ammunition storage area for the boat's rocket-propelled grenades. The resulting explosion was a brilliant orange sphere that expanded and then collapsed in a fraction of a second, leaving nothing but a spreading slick of burning fuel and a few charred pieces of debris. The remaining 4 boats in the northern group immediately broke formation, scattering in 4 different directions to avoid the predatory reach of the aircraft. The coordination between the air assets and the surface ships was a masterpiece of modern military synchronization. In the Combat Direction Center of the Nimitz, the air tactical controller was managing the kill boxes, ensuring that the fighters and helicopters did not fly into the path of the 5-inch shells being fired by the USS Mason. At 6:10 in the morning, Raven 2 reported a secondary threat. 2 Iranian boats had managed to get within 2,000 yards of the carrier's stern hidden by the thick black smoke rising from the earlier kills. The MH-60 Sierra pivoted in flight, its nose dipping as it accelerated toward the new threat. The co-pilot squeezed the trigger for the 19-shot rocket pod mounted on the starboard pylon. Two 2.75-inch hydro rockets shrieked away from the helicopter, their motors leaving twin white trails in the humid air. The rockets impacted the water 10 meters apart, the pressure wave from the underwater detonations lifting the nearest Iranian boat nearly 5 feet out of the water. The boat slammed back down into the swell, with a bone-jarring impact that threw its crew into the scuppers and stalled its engines. The environment of the battle was now a chaotic mix of sensory extremes. The roar of the jet engines, the thumping of the rotors, the staccato bark of the machine guns, and the heavy, periodic crump of exploding rockets created a wall of sound that was nearly physical. The sea was no longer blue. It was a patchwork of white foam, black oil slicks, and the orange glow of burning wreckage. The sun was now fully above the horizon, casting a harsh, flat light that revealed the true scale of the devastation. At least 15 Iranian vessels were either sunk or dead in the water, their crews attempting to navigate the burning slicks. Despite the heavy losses, the Iranian command vessel, still loitering 10 miles to the east, continued to broadcast orders for the remaining boats to close the distance. It was a calculated sacrifice, an attempt to find a single opening in the American armor. But the wall of steel provided by the air power intervention was proving impenetrable. Every time an Iranian boat attempted to accelerate toward the carrier, a Hellfire missile or a burst of cannon fire was there to meet it. The professional discipline of the United States Navy was on full display. Every shot was aimed, every maneuver was calculated, and every threat was prioritized with cold, mechanical efficiency.